Kara Shalom, welcome to our watercolor journey. At least we are able to upload a video again amidst the unscheduled power outages here in South Africa. Well, today we are going to look at greens in particular. So the materials used are listed in the description below. On the palette, we have Cobalt Blue, Yellow Ochre, a soft green mix with Cobalt Blue and Yellow Ochre, and a bluer green mix with more Cobalt and a bit less Yellow Ochre, Burnt Sienna, Burnt Umber, and an olive grey-green mix with Cobalt Blue and Burnt Umber, and finally a grey-brown mix with Cobalt Blue and Burnt Sienna. Sometimes the mixes might look strange on your palette, but once you have painted them, they look very natural and beautiful. Use a swatch card to test your paints before you commit them to paper. Draw a rough sketch on your picture plane to place your objects and to orient yourself as to where you want to place your focus point. Use a large brush to add spots of water into the sky area. Don't wet the entire sky area, just a few spots here and there, up to the horizon line. Don't worry about the tree and the bushes in the background. You will use the moisture in the paper to make a soft background for those trees. Start with some clean cobalt blue in the sky. Add the blue randomly across the paper. Add some to the wet areas and some to the dry areas, and then use the brush to help the paint spread. Remember to leave some white patches for the clouds though. Then add some yellow ochre below the sky, below the blue area. Take care here that the ochre and the blue don't mix, because it will give you a greenish sky. Rinse your brush thoroughly between washes for this one. Now you can start with the bushes in the background. You can start with a burnt umber and cobalt mix. Gently dab the color into the wet area just above the horizon line. Because your foreground is still dry, the paint will spread upwards into the sky area. Add a bit of the burnt sienna and cobalt mix here. Burnt sienna is a bit warmer than burnt umber, so it would create depth and variety. The grey-greens produced by these colors will give a lovely soft background, which gives great distance to the painting. We are trying to get the greens as natural as possible. So now you can add some of the cobalt and yellow ochre mix, where you have more cobalt than ochre. So it will be a touch cooler. If you want the green warmer, just add more yellow ochre. Just dab the color in lightly and let it spread naturally on the wet surface. You can already see the variety of greens coming out of these beautiful mixes. Use the burnt sienna mix to add a bit more warmth and shade to the base of the tree line. You can do the base color of the foliage for the tree now as well. Use the warmer green where you mixed more yellow ochre into the cobalt and dab it lightly into the tree shape. Spread the paint a bit with a brush if needed. Your sky area should be damp, if not dry, by now, so the paint shouldn't spread too much. However, you might have a harder line on the left and softer lines on the right, as the paper tends to dry faster at the edges at times. These soft and hard lines will help to give dimension to your tree, so don't fuss too much about them. Add some of the cooler yellow ochre mix to the center of the tree to give a deeper shade to the foliage. Again, just dab it lightly and allow it to spread. Your paints should be a bit thicker now. If you need to mix more paint, make sure that it is less watery than before. If it is too watery, it will cause blooms to form, and for this painting here, you don't want that. Cobalt is slightly granulating, so you will see some separation in the colors. This usually gives a beautifully stratified effect. You can now start with the foreground, which in this case is done wet on dry. If you are worried that the paint will fuse upward, leave a tiny white gap between your tree line and the foreground. Add the bluer yellow ochre mix here. Cool colors recede and warm colors come forward. You want to create distance, so the cooler mix will work well here. For texture, you can apply some dry brushing and leave a few places white. Also, keep the road in mind, so pay attention to the perspective here. Add a few dabs of the warmer yellow ochre mix to the front. Wet the brush and add some clean yellow ochre to the middle ground. You want it a bit wetter here to give a soft texture to the first layer of the foreground. Use the cobalt and burnt sienna to add a few darker areas for shadows to define the terrain a bit more. If you find that the foreground is too cold, you can add some yellow ochre to diffuse the cobalt a bit. By playing around with the greens and browns, your greens will develop naturally. Use the burnt sienna in the immediate foreground. It is your warmest color, so it will bring this part of your terrain to the front, while naturally pushing the bluer greens to the back. Add a few strokes of burnt umber for variety. Bring in some of the cobalt and burnt sienna mix to add a few shadows. Rinse the brush and then use the yellow ochre to wash the road. Again, leave a tiny white gap if you are worried that the paint will fuse. Pay attention to the direction of the strokes here. The terrain was done in mostly horizontal and a few diagonal strokes, but the road is done from top to bottom. The brush strokes show the direction in which the road goes. Add a few strokes of burnt umber and some of the burnt sienna mix to the front of the road. Close to the horizon, the road should be lighter as if it's fading away, so you want to darken the front of the road a bit to help with the perspective. To tie the sky and the road as well as the blue in the foliage, you can add touches of cobalt to the road as well. For added texture, you can use splashes of tiny drops of water in the foreground. These drops will cause blooms here, which will add an interesting element to the foreground. Be very careful though, not to drop too much water. These blooms give almost the same effect as salt, so you can use salt if you don't want to drop the water in here. Allow the painting now to dry. The water blooms have made beautiful light patches where it pushed the paint away. You can use this to add bushes to your foreground, or you can leave them as is and later add some grasses. Now you can use a thin brush like a rigger to paint the tree trunk. Use yellow ochre to start with. Add tiny bits of burnt umber here and there, and then some of the umber mix to give the trunk a shadow side on the left. Don't use long, flat brush strokes here. You want to create a bit of texture in the trunk, so just dab the paint in or make short dashes lightly with a brush. Add some of the burnt sienna mix for the darkest shade and then ground the tree with a few dark strokes. Try to give the tree a natural shape, not straight like a pole. Give it a kink here and there. That's quite okay. Use the same kind of brush and yellow ochre for the first layer of the fence poles. Again, keep the perspective in mind. They should be taller and thicker closer to you, and then become thinner and shorter the closer you get to the horizon line. They should also be further apart in front and closer together as they move away from you. Use the darker paint to add a shadow side to each of the poles. Draw the horizontal strats in short strokes. These should also not be definite, mere suggestions. Wider apart close to you, narrower closer as they fade into the distance. Define the sides of the road with a bit of the darker paint. Use the burnt umber mix to create the branches in the tree. You can start at the trunk and pull the brush outwards, lifting it slightly as you go to taper to the tip. You can also start lightly at the outer edge and press a bit harder the closer you get to the trunk. You can still use the same thin brush and some of the lighter yellow ochre mix to add the foliage. Dip the brush in the paint and lightly add the paint. These brushes usually don't hold as much water as the bigger brushes, so you can get a lovely loose effect if you use the tip or the belly of the brush. The lighter ochre mix gives a soft light green to the sunny side of the tree, but as you move towards the center and then the left, add some of the bluer ochre mix. You want to enhance the shadow side. Play around with the two ochre mixes to create a variety of natural greens in your tree. While that dries, you can add another layer of greens to the grassland. Layering helps to strengthen the color and gives you natural shadowy areas. The tree has dried a bit, so now you can add a layer of burnt umber mix for even darker shadows. This burnt umber and cobalt mix gives you a grey-green color that fits nicely with the greens in the tree. To enhance the horizon line, you can now add some bushes. The background has very soft edges, so it recedes quite far. The hard edges of this new layer will bring these newly added bushes much more forward. Use the colors on your palette to create variety and interest in the bushes. The bluer colors will give depth, and the warmer colors will bring dimension. Add a few darker lines to define the terrain some more. If you think the paint is too stark, you can soften it with your fingertip. Use the bluer mixes at the back and the sienna and umber in the front. You can use the belly of the brush to add some more greens and browns to the foreground. Make it more interesting by adding darker colors for shadows. It is really convenient to buy premixed greens, but if you want your greens to be really natural, try mixing them yourself. Yellow ochre or raw sienna mixed with different blues create the most interesting greens. Yellows like cadmium yellow or lemon yellow tend to give brighter, more commercial greens. Don't be afraid to experiment with your colors. Color mixing is one of the most satisfying elements of watercolor painting. So there you have it. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon. Vaya con Dios.